Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the third meeting of the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee. Welcome back to our committee members, to the staff, and to the members of the public who are joining us. As a reminder, the meeting is being broadcast, and you can follow along on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. The Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee acknowledges the land we are meeting on is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And Toronto is now still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As we do with our meetings, I would like to request that we do a verbalization of our names just to acknowledge who's present in the room. I will start. I'm the chair of TAC, as well as Councillor Wong Tam. I'm a little sleep deprived. Many of you will know that I missed our last meeting because I just have a brand new baby, and he's 6 weeks old and very happy.
Good morning. I'm Deirdre Boyle. I'm one of the accessibility consultants in the People, Equity, and Human Rights Division, and my pronouns are she and her.
Hi, it's Stephanie Marinich-Lee, member.
Hello, it's Jason Michelle here. It's my second meeting. Thank you.
Michael Michelli, member.
Hi there, I'm Wendy Porch. I'm a committee member. I'm the executive director at the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto.
Michelle Grimley-Patrides. I'm a member and I work with Community Living Toronto.
Miranda Frey. I'm a member from Toronto District School Board, Next Steps Employment Center.
Hi, I'm Bhuvani Sivanasundram. I'm also a member and my pronouns are she and her.
My name is Jennifer Forks. I'm with the City Clerk's Office. I provide meeting management support to this committee.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Ling. I'm from City Clerk's Office. I support this committee.
Sound like a political complaints when we're saying we support it. I'm Lynn Genova, and I work with this committee, and I think I've told you this is my favorite. And please note our four-legged member has a name plate today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Katisha McGregor from the City Clerk's Office, and I support this committee. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Robin Shilett from the Public Consultation Unit, and I'm supporting the first item on the agenda, working on the single-use items and takeaway.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Fernandez. I work in solid waste management services at the city, and I'm also supporting the first item on the agenda.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Charlotte Ueda, also with solid waste management services and supporting the first item on the agenda.
My name is Annette Sinovietz. I'm from Solid Waste Management Services, and I'll be presenting today on the first item on the agenda.
Good morning. My name is Carlisle Can. I'm the acting general manager this week for solid waste, here to support my staff and support the committee as it moves through its agenda.
Okay. Thank you. Let's go to this other side of the room.
Yeah, Yin Brown, accessibility consultant with People, Equity, Human Rights.
Sorry, I turned it off.
Good morning. My name is Wahida Rahman, and I'm the Director for Equity, Diversity, and Human Rights, and my pronoun is she and her.
My name is Mazen Aribi. I'm the 2019 ACAT Chair, Advisory Committee on Accessible Transit. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nina Arbabzadeh, and I'm here from Cities, Shelter Support and Housing Administration.
Good morning. My name is Lorraine Hewitt, and I am here with Councillor Wong Tam's office supporting the chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any other members of the staff who are here to support the meeting? Okay, who will probably have an active speaking and participation role today? Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Emily Marmorio. I'm helping with item 1 as well.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. Okay, so fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. As we proceed with our agenda, are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interests Act? Okay, seeing none, we can proceed. If members do have an interest in the future, just to remind you is that you'll have to file a written declaration of the clerks, and we have all those forms now available to you. May I please have a motion to confirm the minutes of our last meeting on June the 4th, 2019? Michael, moved by Michael. All in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Thank you. So just proceeding to the order paper, and I want to thank Glenn, who is not here today, but Glenn did a fantastic job, I heard, of chairing our last meeting. So that tells me that I could probably skip some meetings and do more baby duty from time to time. It feels great. But thank you very much, everyone. I just heard that it was an exceptional meeting, and maybe that's an indication that if the chair steps away, the meeting gets better. Okay, so the first item on the agenda is the chair's report, which I will hold and deliver very shortly. Item number 2, actually, sorry, I should read the title. D1 3.1, Chair's Report. I will hold that and speak to it. DI 3.2, Accessibility Consideration on Single-Use and Takeaway Item Reductions. We are going to hold that for staff presentations. DI 3.3, Summary of Items Considered by the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee, the 2014 to 2018 term. We will also hold that item for staff presentation. DI 3.4, Proposed Budget Process Changes to Remove Systemic Barriers to Hiring People with Disabilities. We have a letter from committee member Jason Micheli. Is there anyone who's interested in holding this item? We could advance and move it forward as is. There's a recommendation contained in the letter. All members would have had a chance to read it. The materials were advance circulated. Should we just move that? Move without debate? Okay. Sorry, Jason, did you want to hold this item to speak to it?
Chair, I could speak to it if you like, or
Okay.
we could just vote on it. I think it's sort of self-explanatory, but I'm happy to do whatever the committee wishes. Thanks.
Okay. So let's just move on with the recommendations then. Okay, I've seen lots of nods. And Jason, do you want to move your letter? Sorry.
So I'm happy if, Chair, if you want to read the letter aloud and then read the motion, I can speak to it or answer any questions that people may have if need be.
Okay, I believe we could probably deal with this letter fairly quickly just because the recommendation is very clear. So we will address this now. I'll read the recommendations before us. The recommendation is that City Council exempt all operating and capital costs related to AODA compliance and accessibility initiatives from any 2020 proposed budget target reductions. City Council direct the Executive Director, Financial Planning, in consultation with People, Equity and Human Rights and other relevant divisions to conduct research on and determine feasibility of options for a centralized budget fund for all accessibility-related accommodations and initiatives, including but not limited to employee accommodation costs, American Sign Language interpretation, note-taking services, and captioning services, and provide an update on potential actions and next steps to the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee at a future committee date in 2019. Jason?
I can speak to that. Essentially, I'm a new member on the committee, but in the short time I've been here, it's come to my attention that there are some issues with accommodation for people that work for the City of Toronto in terms of how the budget process works. My understanding is that there's not a centralized fund to fund the accommodations. It basically falls on each department. Some may be better resourced than others to do this. So there seems to be a bit of a disparity amongst departments in how disability-related accommodations get funded. So what I'm proposing, and I do want to also thank Michael McNeely, who I don't think is here today, who also had a hand in this, but oh, there you are. Okay. Basically, the issue is we'd like to see two things, and that's for the accommodation fund to be exempt from the 2019 budget because we don't know what that's going to be, and budgets are prone to being vulnerable to cuts. We don't want to see these accommodation expenses cut, and to also look into a more centralized accommodation fund that could be exempt from budget cuts that would fund these necessary accommodations. So we'd like to have that studied, looked into. We'd like to look at how other organizations do what international and domestic human rights law to see the best way that could be done. So that's essentially what's being proposed, is that the accommodation expenses be exempt from the 2020 budget at this point, and to look into the feasibility of a centralized accommodation fund that essentially that we wouldn't have to worry about each budget every year. There'd be a centralized fund set up that employees could access for their accommodation needs.
Great, thank you very much. Michael, did you want to speak to this?
Yes. Do I hold
it sounds to me I should have held the item because now we're moving into longer remarks. But
Hi, I am in complete agreement with Jason. Through my independent investigation with staff at City Hall, I've become aware of this issue, and I wanted Jason to go forward because he had more experience with writing than I did at this present time. But it is my understanding that this is an important and essential issue for city staff, because I've heard from city staff that they do not feel welcome in certain departments because AODA training is not cost feasible for them. Thank you.
okay, thank you very much. Anyone else? We're ready to proceed. Okay, and thank you very much for bringing the letter forward. This is a conversation that I know that I've had with our accessibility advisory consultant as well. I fully support the recommendations in the letter, and also thank the city staff who've actually raised this concern. This was a very valuable bit of information that we hope to rectify moving forward, not just in the 2020 budget process, but starting there, but beyond that. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Thank you very much. And then finally to item number 5, request for update on the Wheel-Trans appeal process. We also have a letter from Michael Maselli. I know that, Michael, we're probably going to hold this down. We're going to have a bit of a discussion on it. Okay, so I'm going to hold that in your name, Michael. And I would like to add one new piece of business to the agenda. This letter would have been circulated in advance as of the past few days, I believe. I'm just going to read you the title. If anyone needs me to read the entire letter, I'm happy to do so. But essentially, it's a letter from myself as the chair to the accessibility and safety at the Toronto Raptors parade and rally. Why don't I just go through it very quickly? There's a quick background and then a recommendation. I just want to add and move the recommendation. So on Monday, June the 17th, the City of Toronto and MLSE hosted a victory parade and rally in celebration of the Toronto Raptors' historic NBA win. While the intention of the event was to allow space for all fans to participate in cheering on the team, overcrowding and a lack of clear pathways significantly affected accessibility for fans with disabilities, as well as safety for all participants. The city has an obligation to ensure that events of this nature follow the provincial guidelines for planning accessible events. Access Ontario directs that consideration be given to concerns such as accessible parking, accessible transportation, pathways and barriers, washroom access, and seating. While accessible areas were set aside in front of the main stage and on the roof of the skating building, the overcrowding, lack of proper wayfinding, and clear pathways meant that these areas were not truly available to those who needed them. Mayor Tory has stated publicly that the city manager will be working with the police, the TTC, and other city divisions and Toronto sports teams to review the planning protocols for the event and identify areas of deficiency. It is imperative that improved accessibility planning be included in this review. Events that are planned with accessibility as a core principle must necessarily include protocols that increase safety for all participants. Clear pathways would have allowed for improved emergency response. Comprehensive crowd management may be ensured that area transit remain accessible for all users, and the unfortunate incidents of stampeding and trampling were mitigated. With the overall safety implications and equitable access in mind, I ask the city take steps to incorporate improved accessibility planning into future events. And the recommendation is essentially the executive committee direct the city manager to include in the review of the Raptors parade and rally a comprehensive analysis of the accessibility considerations and improvement opportunities for future events. Such analysis to be completed in consultation with the People, Equity and Human Rights Division, as well as Social Development and Finance Administration's Crisis Response Team. And I submit this before the committee. Unless there's a requirement for a debate, I would just like to add that. Okay? All those in favor of adding this to the agenda? Okay. And if there's no debate, we can probably just vote and move it along. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Thank you very much, folks. Okay, so coming back to the top of the agenda, Michael?
I just have a question. Do you think we can also include ASL and captioning information along with the mentions of safety that you had with the walkways and all that stuff? Because I would have liked to attend the Raptors parade, but I didn't know that I could.
Yes, so I can certainly make that amendment.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. So moving back to the top of the agenda, and thank you for that. The first item is the chair's report. This one is lengthy. You tell me. I could read the entire chair's report. I can try to summarize the report. It was circulated in advance. I'll try to be as succinct as possible. Okay, so let's. Okay. I'm advised we don't have a very long agenda today. So, but these are some of the pertinent issues that rose between our last meeting and this meeting. So, number one, the Paramedics Staffing. On June the 20th, 2019, Council authorized the addition of 28 frontline paramedics this year, subject to the confirmation of anticipated provincial funding to the Toronto Paramedic Services to help address workload tied to increased emergency call demands. Reasons for rising demand, including an aging and a growing population, increasing need to transport patients to specialized facilities, and increases to Toronto's vulnerable and marginalized populations. Second item on the chair's report is addressing loss of rooms for rent. On June 20th, the City Council approved an official plan amendment to address the loss of rooms in rooming houses as a form of shared affordable accommodations in Toronto. This loss is occurring at a rate of redevelopment. When rooming house rooms are lost to development, teams often need support services and financial assistance to find and maintain new affordable housing, as they are often unaffordable and unable to pay those rents as a self-contained unit. The Accessible Canada Act, Bill C-81, this was actually really quite exciting, another step forward. The Accessible Canada Act received royal assent on June the 21st. This act aims, as many of you already know, to enhance the full and equal participation of all persons, especially persons with disabilities, in society. This is to be achieved through realization within the purview of matters coming within the legislative authority of Parliament of a Canada without barriers, particularly by definition, removal, and prevention of barriers. The fourth item is a review of the City of Toronto's Municipal Code, Chapter 546, Licensing for Vehicle for Hires. This is always a big heated discussion at City Council, and we'll be voting on it next week. On June the 24th, the General Government and Licensing Committee passed several amendments to the Municipal Code governing vehicles for hire. Amendments will be considered by City Council next week on July 16th. Proposed amendments to Chapter 546 include the establishment of an accessibility fund available to wheelchair drivers and owners not under contract with Wheel-Trans, a requirement that all private transportation company drivers providing accessible service must successfully complete an accessible training program. An amendment to the Taxi Cab Bill of Rights stating that drivers cannot refuse service to individuals with disabilities where service can be accommodated and cannot refuse service to individuals accompanied by a service animal. That was a big piece of, that was a big item at the committee, lots of healthy discussion, and as I noted again, it's going to City Council for vote next week. We've had some proclamations and flag raisings. National Deafblind Awareness Month. The City of Toronto designated June as National Deafblind Awareness Month to recognize and celebrate the contributions that individuals who are deafblind make in their communities with the support of interveners who serve as a bridge to communicate with individuals who are deafblind. The celebration on Civic Square, Nathan Phillips Square, is always a very good one. We encourage everyone to attend the one next year as well. What's coming up, which will be of interest to the committee members, there are some upcoming and ongoing consultations, decision-making in your city, public consultation on the Special Committee on Governance. In December 2018, City Council created a special committee on governance. This committee will consider the impact of the city's governance structure and processes arising from the reduction in the size of council, and to make recommendations to City Council on further changes to its governance structure. This consultation is closing soon, and we would love to have your input to the city by no later than July 15th, 2019. And then finally, the city and the TTC Transit Review, always a big topic of interest for our committee. Public transit services in Toronto are integral to the city's and region's viability. They are wishing to provide input on the proposed changes, and the input can be provided online. Transit Responsibilities Review Survey, which will be open until August 31st, 2019. That brings me to the condensed version of the chair's report. And if I can have a motion to receive that. Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. Can you just hold on, please? Thank you. Yeah, sorry. I understand that there's a motion on the chair's report, and I haven't seen it yet. So if you can just all hang on, please. Michael, thank you very much for the recommendation to be added to the chair's report. What I'm going to suggest is that the staff introduce that as a new item. So they're going to prepare it for you as a new item, okay? Because it's not technically part of my chair's report, but I do support the intention that you're pursuing. All those in favor of the chair's report? Okay, thank you very much. That carries. We will now hear from Annette Sinowick, who is the Interim Director of Policy Planning and Support, Solid Waste Management. She'll be providing us with a presentation on single-use and takeaway items reduction. And this is, of course, everyone, item number 2. Annette, welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much. We've not, solid waste has not been at the committee very often, so I just wanted to provide a brief overview of what solid waste is responsible for at the city. So Solid Waste Management Services is responsible for the collection of recycling, garbage, and organics from curbside households, in parks, and along street-side litter bins. We are also responsible for the processing of those recyclables and the composting of the organics. We also take responsibility over the disposal of the waste in landfill, and we also work on developing programs and policies to support waste reduction and diversion from landfill. Today's presentation is going to be an update on an overview of why the City of Toronto is undertaking a single-use items and takeaway items reduction work plan development. We'll also be providing a summary of Phase 1 consultations that took place in the fall of 2018. And finally, we'll provide some details on upcoming Phase 2 consultations that will take place in 2019. As many of you are probably aware, the topic of single-use items and plastics has been very prevalent in the media and the news. Reasons for this is due to their proliferation as litter in our waterways and challenges associated with recycling. There were several times last year that City Council directed and had conversations with staff to undertake work on this item. That included in January asking for staff to look at reducing single-use items through the long-term waste management strategy, a strategy that was approved by City Council in 2016. And the long-term strategy was also given staff the goal of making Toronto the province's the first city with a circular economy and a zero-waste future. Single-use items were also discussed at a report in April of 2018, which was talking about the complexity and the challenges with Toronto's blue bin recycling. So as we know, there's issues with contamination in blue bin recycling. There's been a lot of media around that and due to changing markets and the quality of materials. And single-use items definitely have an impact on the quality of City of Toronto's recyclable quality. As a leader in waste diversion programs and policies, when the State of the Blue Bin report was provided by City Council also gave direction to make a formal request to the federal government to address plastic pollution. And this report that's available online outlines 9 recommendations on how the federal government should be dealing with plastics pollution. This report also gave clear direction to staff on developing a single-use items and reduction plan and to report back on measures to reduce these items. The direction provided included developing a work plan that aimed at reducing the use of single-use and takeaway packaging in Toronto, in order to develop that plan to make sure that there was a robust and fulsome consultation with stakeholders that may be impacted by any changes to how these items are distributed or provided to residents in the City of Toronto, to specifically develop a policy that looked at the restriction of the use of plastic straws, and to make sure that we're consulting with businesses, community health organizations, and other stakeholders on any kind of proposed policy that would restrict any of these items. The next part of this presentation provides an overview of our first phase of consultation that took place in fall of 2018 on the reduction strategy development. During this phase of consultation, our objectives were to define what a single-use item would be so that there would be a shared and common understanding of the items that we're working to address. And we're also looking to have objectives during this phase of consultation to have conversations with residents on which single-use items should be addressed by future policy, as well as what methods should be employed by the city or policies developed in order to curb their use and prevalence in our waste stream. We also wanted to ask residents and the public and stakeholders for any additional opportunities to promote reuse of more durable items so that single-use items wouldn't be as prevalent. The definition that was provided at these consultations was presented as the following: any product designed for a single use, after which it is disposed of, whether into the garbage or a waste diversion stream as solid waste. So typically, the items that we're looking at are designed for durability, or sorry, not designed for durability, but typically designed for a one-time use purpose. This next slide provides examples of the types of takeaway items that were consulted on. So it includes things like hot and cold to-go cups, regardless of the type of material that they're made from. So it could include polystyrene foam cups, paper cups, plastic cups. It was also looking at plastic bags or paper bags, disposable cutlery, plastic straws, and general types of takeaway containers, including black plastic, clear plastic, or polystyrene foam. This phase of consultation also talked about the types of approaches that could be used in a future reduction strategy. So one type of approach is a mandatory approach. Mandatory approaches include examples like fees, bans, requirements to have signage in establishments, and are generally enforced. These types of mandatory approaches could also include a by-request bylaw, where establishments would be required to ask consumers and patrons to request items that may be single-use if required. A city could also look at a disposal ban at its city-owned transfer stations. So after materials are collected or loads of waste come in and are taken to our transfer stations, we could look at potentially banning those loads should they contain too many single-use products contained within the load. There's also the opportunity to employ voluntary approaches. So this could be done at any time prior to the city actually mandating anything. And voluntary approaches could include incentives or rewards that are taken by businesses. For example, if you bring in your own cup, you could have a reduction in the price of the beverage that you may be consuming. It could also look at education or promotional campaigns, grassroots initiatives that might be taking place in communities, as well as signage that could be posted outside of businesses. We could also take mandatory and voluntary approaches that could be combined. So for an example of this, it could be that the city could mandate that businesses are required to post signage encouraging the use of reusable items, but then the actual customer would only be voluntarily required to, voluntarily bring in their reusable mug. So the business would be required to post the signage encouraging residents or patrons to behave a certain way, but the actual point of sale, they could use a reusable mug or not. So we had pretty fulsome activities during our first phase of consultations. We tried to engage the public in a number of ways. We had an online survey where we had more than 20,000 respondents. We had a public event, webcast, and a webinar, and we held 4 stakeholder-specific meetings. The stakeholder-specific meetings were for food and beverage establishments, non-governmental organizations and environmental organizations, retailers and manufacturers of single-use products, the general public, as well as accessibility organizations. And in order to advertise this consultation activity, we used extensive print and digital marketing. We had over 1.8 million digital media, social media impressions, and we also had direct email communications with a listserv that the city maintains of over 7,000 individual email addresses. There was also an independent polling that took place during this. So independent to all of the consultations that the city was doing, we hired an independent polling third company to also test some of the questions that we're asking during consultation to ensure that we got a non-biased set of communication and feedback on our first phase of consultation. During this phase, the types of questions that we asked included, do you use single-use or takeaway items? And what types of single and takeaway items do you want to see reduced in the City of Toronto? What types of approaches do you prefer? So the mandatory or voluntary that I mentioned earlier, and also an opportunity to provide feedback on other ways we could approach the reduction of these items. A summary of results is contained on this next slide. So as I mentioned before, over 20,000 individual sets of feedback were received either through the online polling or in-person consultations. And what we heard was that the majority of survey participants were very likely to use reusable options if they were available rather than a single-use product. We also found that there was consistent support for having city-led policies, whether they be mandatory or voluntary measures put in place to help reduce the prevalence of these items, and that in general, there was pretty strong support for mandatory measures to help control these items. Our third-party polling, as I mentioned before, also mirrored some of these results that we had, although the levels of support were slightly lower than our city-led consultations. Full consultation results are also available in a report that was provided to the Infrastructure and Environment Committee on May 23rd of this year. Specifically, what we heard from our accessibility stakeholder consultation sessions were that the types of single-use or takeaway items that were most important for accessibility included bendable straws for eating and drinking, water bottles for hydration, coffee lids to be used for safety reasons, certain types of medical, health, and sanitary items, and packaging for pre-prepared meals. We also heard that any future policies and reduction strategy should consider an equity lens, and we should review that against any future policies and programs. So, for example, a litterless lunch could unintentionally place burden on women and primary caregivers who shop for or pack and clean up their children's meals, and reusable items at times could be high cost, so people living with low incomes may also be impacted by any restrictive approaches or fees. And we also heard that there are perceived laws or liability concerns when it comes to the use of patrons bringing in their own containers, and confusion around any health and safety regulations that might be associated with people bringing in their own containers. We also heard from community accessibility stakeholders that they don't want to be viewed as to be the reason that certain policies or programs aren't put in place, and that there was support for a mechanism to reduce items, and that we should also look at other items such as water bottles, cigarette butts, before dealing with plastic straws. And also there was a request to ensure that any information on a future program and policy for a reduction strategy is accessible using Braille, large text, and contrasting colors where possible. The next part of this presentation is about opportunities to get involved and provide input on the proposed single-use items and takeaway reduction strategy, and it also outlines some of the objectives that we'll be trying to seek in this phase. So in developing our work plan, some of the prioritization and considerations for developing a strategy that we will be looking at is what materials that are single-use items are currently recyclable or not recycled in the city's Blue Bin program. We'll also be considering targeting materials that are known contributors to street litter and marine litter. We'll also be reflecting the results from the survey and polling data from our first phase in consultation. And we'll also aim to be harmonizing any policies that the city brings forward with any federal or provincial initiatives that come forward as well. We'll also be working to develop the work plan by reviewing all of the public comments received, identifying additional public and stakeholder priorities for future programming, and analyzing further the results of the polling data, and also conducting a larger jurisdictional scan where some of these, some other cities or jurisdictions may have had similar policies on products to reduce items. We'll also be looking at any additional data that would be available. Again, we mentioned how prevalent these items may be in litter. We'll be also reviewing any operational challenges with implementing a future reduction strategy, and considering any alternatives to the use of the single-use items. In order to make our proposal on a reduction strategy in the future robust, we've also retained an external consultant who has been used to help inform and develop the set of considerations and evaluation criteria that will be proposed in this next phase of consultation. So what you will expect to see in this next phase of consultation will basically be sharing of results from phase one, so similar to what was provided here today. We'll also be looking on feedback for any voluntary or mandatory measures that are brought forward to stakeholders and members of the public. And we'll also be looking to share this information through additional engagement channels, which include telephone town halls and a focus on youth engagement. This next slide outlines basically a table of timelines. So we are working throughout the course of this summer, providing some stakeholders with specific updates. So we were recently also at the Toronto Area Business Improvement Association meeting and provided a similar presentation as we did here today. And we'll be planning on receiving notification or distributing notification on how to get involved in the second phase of consultation later this summer or early fall. So we'll be using regular channels that you would consider, such as website, our email listserv, and working with organizations that might be able to help also spread the message of this next phase of consultation. We'll also be having similar tactics, so public events, webcasts, online surveying again, and then we'll also be looking to meet with specific stakeholders, including accessibility organizations, environmental organizations, food and manufacturing, restaurants, retail, and the waste industry. And in terms of a report back, we're looking at the second quarter of 2020, so most likely by June, to have a full waste reduction work plan for single-use and takeaway items. What will be included in the single-use and takeaway items work plan will be proposed timelines for any initiatives, so whether they be mandatory or voluntary measures to address the use of items, any resourcing requirements in order to implement the strategy, promotion education supports that may be required, as well as development of metrics so we can better understand, once these measures are implemented, how well we're doing at actually reducing those items. And that is the end of my presentation, and I'm open to any questions and answers at this time.
Annette, thank you very much for that presentation. I found it very interesting. It's really quite technical. We are at the portion of the meeting where we welcome questions from our committee members. I recognize some hands. First one is Wendy. Please let me know if you have any questions. Okay. Wendy, go ahead, please.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Michael, thank you.
I had a couple of questions that are largely related to the kind of methods that you're using when you're collecting data. I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more to the various methods that you noted on your slides. So you talked about an online survey. Was the survey accessible? You talked about a number of in-person events. I wondered whether or not there were accommodations for people with disabilities at all of those events. I think there was a talk of a webcast too. Was it an accessible webcast? So that's in terms of the data that you've collected, because it's quite significant. Obviously, it's informing the choices that you're making going forward. And then I wanted to know if you could speak to, in terms of phase two, you noted that the teletown hall was going to be something that was going to help you in terms of the accessibility considerations. Can you explain also what a teletown hall is?
Sure.
So two-part.
We actually have someone here from our public consultation unit that was helping with all of those, and she would have some more information on the accessibility of each of those tactics.
Hi. So the first one you mentioned was the online survey. So we use the city's tool that's been approved by various city divisions. It's called Checkmarket, and that would be accessible via screen reader. We also, in all of our consultation materials, include a note that people can call us for accommodation, and I'm the personal point of contact for that. So we do call people back, and if they would like to go through the survey with us or discuss any of the questions, we can do that over the phone if the computer's not the best way. In terms of accessibility for the public meetings, at the stakeholder meeting for accessibility, we had an ASL interpreter there. And I believe, and of course, everything was AODA compliant. In terms of other accommodations, those would be by request. For this next phase of consultation, we're looking at enhancing all of that. So making sure that we have captioning, ASL interpretation, a support person there for all of the various meetings. And then the teletown halls you also asked about. So those are a call-in and call-out service that is used in order to reach a very high number of people. For those, the consultants that we are looking at working with need to be AODA compliant, and that's part of their proposal to us in terms of that service. So those are through voice over the telephone, and then we're also looking at what accommodations can be made for people who would like to participate on screen via online webinar. Thanks.
Any other questions, Wendy? No? Michael? Ms. Seeley?
I wanted to mention that I thought the statement that you made about initiatives to help encourage people to recycle or to dispose of the trash appropriately by perhaps giving them a financial incentive or rewarding them for doing that is commendable. But I wanted to ask you about people with disabilities who are not able to be part of those initiatives. So for example, if you're going to reward someone who is recycling an assistive device or recycling something that they need, then that's not going to happen. So is there another way that you can reward people with disabilities?
Yeah, typically incentives would be at the restaurant or the business level usually provided, so the city wouldn't be able to mandate incentives at that through that mechanism. However, this feedback is great and it's something that we can consider in the proposed work plan. So definitely thank you for that feedback, and we can definitely consider that in as we approach development of the reduction strategy.
Michael, you have 5 minutes.
A solution could be that people with disabilities could tell someone about what they've done to reduce the environmental waste. And then if there's a form or a feedback form, they can get a reward that way. Mm-hmm. So for example, I can say, you know, I have to use straws for my condition, but I encouraged my mom and dad to do recycling this week. That kind of thing.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else for questions? Stephanie, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It's actually just a clarification, really. I think everything is really well done. Just curious, just for my own sanity, to ensure that my brain is working properly. Slide 16 just says that there will be review and comment October, November 2018. And so, but then I'm assuming that that's supposed to be 2019. But I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm...
Thank you. Through the chair, when I was reviewing these slides last night, I also came upon that. It's not clear, so that is meant to say we're reviewing public comment from October and November of last year in order to inform phase 2. So
okay. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for the clarification.
Okay, thank you. Any other members with questions? Okay, Michelle, please, and then Michael.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My comment is actually very similar to Michael's, so thank you, Michael, for bringing up the point about incentives. So I work with folks that usually need things like straws and reusable items, especially around personal hygiene. And so in terms of incentives and subsidies, I think that's very important to consider when the onus is on the individual and it's going to become more expensive for them to use a reusable straw or a cloth alternative to something plastic. I think incentives are a huge consideration, either directly to the individuals or perhaps even starting at an agency level, because a lot of those purchases are made agency-wide. So even information around where alternative, inexpensive items can be purchased, and subsidies ideally, I think is an important consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And Michael? Ms. Ely.
Okay, hi. Excellent presentation. I was just going to say there were news reports about Metro grocery stores in Quebec where they were starting to pilot this idea where, say, if you go to the deli or salad bar, you bring your own container from home, fill it up that way, and there were question marks about public health and public safety. What happens if that container hasn't been cleaned properly and then the person gets ill? So, I mean, I think that was a question mark about it. So I'm curious to see what has been the responses of, say, have you contacted the Metro equivalent here in Ontario to see if they're going to do that? And what has the response been from businesses?
Right now, we haven't proposed the actual work plan for the reduction strategy, so that will be in the second phase of consultation. From our conversations to date with Public Health, Toronto Public Health, there are no issues with people bringing in reusable containers, so there's nothing that prevents them from being able to do that. We've seen a lot of grassroots movements already in certain communities where certain businesses have been encouraged to allow the use of residents bringing in, and again, that's just voluntary measures being taken in advance of any city kind of mandated reduction strategy or policy.
And if I can just make one comment as well, I know with some organizations they'll say bring your own sort of glassware or plates from home, and as a person with a disability, I'm always afraid I'm going to break something or I'm going to drop it, so I've always been hesitant and have just used plastic. And so I know for myself and others that's going to be an issue just because people are afraid to bring sort of glassware with them or carry it around.
Through the chair, to answer your second question about some of the feedback from businesses, it's included also, should there be any mandatory measures that are brought into place to reduce these items, that there should be consideration to any additional stock that the business would have of these items so that they're not put in a financial burden of any kind in order to operate their business.
Okay.
But generally support for reducing items.
Any other members with questions? Okay, Miranda.
Of incentives, sorry, thank you. I was just thinking, sometimes on our utility bills, there's sometimes like a fee for water and waste management. So I'm just wondering, I'm not sure of the logistics of how to set it up through the city, but maybe to promote it as an environmental program and for people to register to participate in this program, and then for those who register and participate, they get a discount off their billing. So that's just another suggestion I want to make. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I see Michael McNeely's hand going up again, so Michael, go ahead.
Hi, I just got some more water so I can keep talking. I apologize. I just wanted to point out that for recycling purposes, it's difficult to figure out which container to put the various items in. It's not accessible for blind people necessarily. I have trouble identifying the pictures and the letters, so I hope that maybe you can review some of how you do the labeling, and whether or not a phone app could perhaps solve that problem. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
And thank you, Michael. Any other members with questions for staff? Stephanie, go ahead. I'm only going to.
It's not a question for staff. I was just going to, Michael, there is a waste wizard on the City of Toronto website that actually you can type in items and it'll indicate whether they go into the garbage disposal, the green bin, or the blue bin. Michael, I'm not sure if you heard that or not, but I just thought I'd share that information.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's very helpful. I actually have a few questions for staff if there are no other member questions. With respect to the target of reducing single-use plastics and the takeaway items, Obviously, much of the garbage is generated at the source of packaging and the manufacturing component. Recognizing that the city has limited jurisdiction over that, is this report is there another parallel piece that's actually taking place at another table at another order of government where they're actually they're talking about using technologies or innovative materials, plant-based materials, that will actually eliminate the even need for single-use plastic by using different materials to manufacture those items, which are the plastic takeaways.
Yeah, so we are definitely having parallel conversations with the provincial government on transitioning the Blue Box program, which would make producers fully responsible for all of the items they produce. So there's that one conversation that's going on there, as well as an organics technical committee that's looking at the potential for more alternatives being compostable products in replacement of these items.
And how successful do you think those conversations are at the moment? Because I see that we're making the advancement. We're putting together a policy that will try to change consumer and vendor behavior, but the packaging is really part of the challenges. If we don't change the way we package, a convenient, portable, flexible, movable at reduced cost lifestyle, everything that we do will actually have a much smaller impact if we don't get it upstream.
Well, we know that the federal government does have some federal interest in reducing plastics items as well. They've put forth a date of 2021 to address certain items, so we'll be keeping an eye on that to see as details come out how they're addressing that. I know that the provincial government also has a strong focus on targeting litter in public spaces and the environment, so it'll be interesting to see what new regulations that might come out in the future. So it's hard to say.
So it sounds to me you're feeling fairly confident that we're heading, all three orders are heading in the right direction?
Yeah, definitely. I believe that the timing right now is well aligned, so at national, federal, provincial, also globally, to address single-use plastic items.
Okay. And then finally, the invention of the single-use plastics or takeaway containers, it was largely due to costs. Cheaper to manufacture. It's an issue around convenience. People pick and go, right? Grab and go. As well as the flexibility of being able to put a number of different items, particularly food items, into single-use plastics and takeout containers. All of that is designed to make lives easier and more portable, more mobile, and oftentimes any type of reduction of that convenience and portability, mobility factor has a disproportionate impact on people who are living with disabilities, people who have less income, people who are more marginalized. Oftentimes these are fast food takeout containers as well, so they're not usually high-end restaurant containers. If I go into a more expensive restaurant, they give me paper packaging. I don't get a lot out of in terms of the food courts. It's a very different story. How do you reconcile that conflict and stress point around the convenience, the cost factor for those with more means, and then those with less means, and then those living with disabilities?
We'll be looking for that type of feedback when we present our work plan in this second phase of consultations in order to make sure that we've considered all of those types of accessibility and convenience factors into our second phase.
Okay, so that's the work to be done in the next phase.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so thank you very much. I think we are ready to just have some remarks and perhaps give the staff here some feedback. Those to speak, Wendy first.
Hi again. So the reason why I was asking about the accessibility of the methods that you used in terms of your data collection and your engagement is obviously just to kind of underscore part of what Councillor Wong-Tam was saying there, that people with disabilities are the people who are going to be most impacted by any kind of mandatory ban on straws or single-use plastics. And, for lots of people, it's not just a matter of we kind of use this term of convenience. It's not convenience, it's living. right? It's the difference between being able to drink something and not being able to drink something. Like, that's a very fundamental requirement that people have. I'm encouraged to see that, that this has been noted in terms of the narrative of issues that you're talking about through the consultations. I did notice that you didn't have necessarily attendance being available at your face-to-face events. It sounds like some of the accessibility stuff only came up at the one event that was sort of earmarked to be an accessibility-specific event. This is going to be a theme for people with disabilities across all of these events. If they're not there, it's because they can't get there, or the materials that have been put out into the world are not accessible. So all of those things have to be factored into, I think, all of the engagement activities that you do going forward, because it's not just a matter of one event around accessibility. When we're talking about the people, again, who are impacted by this, it is people with disabilities like those in the room, and it's a matter of life and death for some folks to be able to use a straw. So I just wanted to say that, as much as possible in phase 2, that it's not that you have a specialized meeting for people with disabilities, that you consider that they should be able to come to all of the events that you have, and you might actually even consider some outreach through Deidre and the folks within the People in Equity office to community organizations like the one that I currently lead, because we can put you in touch with people. We could also support consultations that are specific to our memberships. But this is a very, very big issue within this community. The other thing is, I just wanted to say, I throw support behind what Councillor Wong Tam was saying around, is there a way for the city to provide support for initiatives that look at alternative straws, right? So not a ban on straws, but a straw that doesn't have an environmental impact in the same way that the current plastic straws do. So is there some way of funding innovation around this and not looking at trying to get rid of straws entirely, but trying to come up with straws that people can still use, but that are not going to have the same kind of outcome in terms of the environment? Thank you. And also, I'd be willing to work with your department, as I said, as a community organization that can connect to the community on this issue.
And thank you very much, Wendy. The next speaker is Michael McNeely, and then Stephanie.
I just wanted to clarify that I do know about the website. I do know that I can type in what I'm looking to recycle. I'm talking about when you go to the food court and when you have a plate with you and you're trying to go to the recycling bin. That's not accessible for me. And I've noticed this in city property. So what I'm trying to suggest is that maybe there could be an app or some sort of guiding feature that can say, Michael, 300 steps ahead to your left is the place that you can put your can. And that's just what I wanted to mention, because if you want to reduce the environmental footprint, then maybe making recycling easier would be a good way to start. I would also like to second Wendy's comments, and also that it's important to understand that in the midst of all these initiatives, having people with disabilities at all stages of the process hopes to ensure that we are not shamed for appearing not to recycle like everyone else. Because I think fundamentally it's an attitudinal shift that we need to create, and people with disabilities are going to be looked at as not keeping up. But we can't keep up because, unfortunately, we have adaptive needs that we need to meet. And also, we're not able to attend all these consultations to make our points across. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for those comments. Stephanie, please.
Hi. Thank you, Wendy. I think that was an excellent portrayal of relating to the disability community, and I just wanted to sort of jump off of a bit of some of those comments. And I think that Wendy stressed it very nicely in terms of, there obviously are just, the variety of disability is just so vast. And I know that as my disease progresses, I've had to, modify and be more cognizant, because I would be, one of the things that I'm just going to share, because I'm a very very big environmentalist. You wouldn't know it with all my plastic, but I am. So I posted an article about straw banning because I was very, very in favor of it. Because I think, you know, for myself, I thought, okay, I can be prudent, I can bring a straw with me, you know, as long as there's someone who's, you know, available to assist me. Or now I do see that there are alternatives, paper-based straws. And this was just on the Facebook, and I was shocked. I've heard from people I had never heard from in my life about how afraid they're, and it's fear. And I just wanted to underline that it's not necessarily a not want to, but it's a fear of what am I going to do when this is not around? Is this going to limit my ability to go out and to a restaurant or to a coffee shop or something like that? And that's where what I've noticed is is there going to be a proper alternative available? And one of the things that I suggested was, I completely agree with a straw ban, but you know what? Maybe then it could be a proposal that there would be, either paper or some kind of appropriate alternative for a customer who does require it. And I guess I would just put that in your mind that it's also a bit of a fear the fear of what am I going to do? I can't afford, to keep buying silicone, or stainless steel doesn't necessarily work, or it doesn't attach to my tubes, or a variety of different things. But that's really where it comes from. And I think Wendy is more of an expert on the types of needs that people have, but I wanted to just share that with you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Michelle, please, go ahead.
I'll try to keep this quick. Wendy, thank you for your comments. I just wanted to add that with the folks that I work with, people with developmental disabilities, traditionally they're very left out of these conversations. There's a lot of constraints around the surveys not being in accessible plain language. If someone has a support worker, often they have to prioritize what's going to get done in those number of hours, and meals and survival takes precedence. So going to a meeting is not necessarily going to be something that's possible for them. So I'd highly recommend seeking out organizations like Wendy said, and agencies such as Community Living Toronto, because we indeed have a whole self-advocates council whose purpose is to meet with folks like yourself and give feedback, and they're happy to give feedback. But then you get 20 people in a room, and they've set aside that time every week, and they have the support workers there. And I know it's extra effort on your part, but it's a great way to seek feedback. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you. Anyone else to speak? Okay. I just want to thank staff for the presentation and the work that you're doing. I recognize that unless all three orders of government synthesize this particular direction of new government policies on how we actually carry out our business and do it with an aspirational motivator in mind, which is to go plastic free, to actually try to save the oceans. It produces more than 50% of the oxygens of the world, and we know that rapid acidification is actually just causing unprecedented harm. I think that the committee is giving, I believe, what is very good advice to you and the division to make sure that as you move forward, to do so with a lens of accessibility. And I know that that has been threaded through your presentation, that's something that's top of mind. Unless we get to the source of the manufacturing, the source of the product, I think that a lot of this will be a lot more makeshift on our part to try to do something, to try to create programs, incentives that will target the vendors and the retailers. But unless we get to the source, I fear that this will not be the big, broad, comprehensive program. The City of Toronto, of course, did have a plastic bag ban, as we all know. That was repealed and brought back. And now I can tell you I have endless fabric bags, endless polyester bags, endless semi-plastic, semi-cotton bags, and I'm still receiving parcels wrapped in plastic. There isn't a time where I'm not walking through my own building in the concierge area where there's literally a wall of packages that are being delivered from Amazon or Prime or online retailers, and it is wrapped in every single possible plastic that you can imagine. So if we don't get to that level of consumption and that level of production, I think we're kind of not going to be all rowing in the same direction. So thank you, staff, for your good work, and we'll look forward to seeing you again for phase 2. Yeah, thank you. With that, just to receive the presentation, a motion. Okay, thank you, Jason. All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. Item number 3, the summary of items considered by the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee, 2014 to 2018 term. Our very own Deidre Boyle is going to provide a presentation. And of course, this presentation is to provide us with an update and summary of all the things that we did and did not get to from the previous term. So.
Good morning. I'm just waiting for the screen to come back. So thank you for tasking us with this. It was a good exercise to look at the whole 2014 to 28 term and revisit some of the items that we discussed here at the committee. I didn't know where to start, but I am hoping that I can give at least a highlight of the different priorities from last term and some of the areas that are still outstanding. And for some reason, my computer is, okay. It's very odd. Pardon me, forgive me, yeah, it just, my computer froze. It was. Maybe.
Okay, see, because you have a prompt.
Okay, so now, okay, thank you so much. Okay. So at your last meeting, you asked for this. You requested that we provide an overview of items considered during the last term. So that's what prompted this presentation. And so I went through all of the items, and in the last term, we considered a total of 119 items. And one of the big things for me, which was of significant importance because it was after I started and something I was involved in, was the corporate accessibility policy, which that this committee provided very valuable advice on, and you endorsed it, and it furthered it along, so it went to up to executive, and then council adopted it in the spring in 2018. And then there were a lot of different items around events, ongoing conversations with this committee around the the multi-year accessibility plan, other large strategies such as poverty reduction. We talked about accessible taxis, shelters, stopgap ramps, a lot of discussions around employment and accessible communication. And all of these things, I think, are ongoing conversations. The types of items, so many of the items, there were 27 that really were the chair's reports and then working group updates. And some of those working group updates, although they may not seem, the title might not seem that important, when you actually go into the follow-up from those working group items, they were quite significant and led to important work at the city. And then there were other items that were administrative business, such as changing our name. We changed our name twice last term, and other things like reviewing the terms of reference and things like that. And then the remainder of the items were content that was either initiated by members or by staff who approached the committee and the accessibility team to say, we'd like to come to the committee, and even sometimes through letters from members of the public or outside organizations that wish to engage. And briefly, so a lot of transportation matters did come through TAC. 25 of the items were directly related to transportation. 11 items were related to the design of public spaces. 11 items were related to general accessibility requirements under the AODA, including multi-year accessibility planning and related policies and strategies. 7 items were specifically related to employment at the City of Toronto. 6 were related to customer service, and 5 related to information and communication. And then the 54 remaining items were miscellaneous subjects that didn't fall neatly into those categories. And the reason I categorized it that way was to align with our multi-year plan and which aligns also with the integrated accessibility standard regulation under the AODA. Okay, so this is, I think, probably the most important part is where things ended up. So of the 119 items, 112, so this was a challenge for me because I had to use a little bit of discretion. Technically, all of the items from last term were considered complete because the recommendation was made from the committee, and that sort of is where it was. And also, based on City Council's procedures, outstanding reports, requests, do not carry forward to the next term. So city staff or council are not obligated to report back on those requests. However, having said that, there are many items that staff will continue to work on and report on, even though they're not formal, like it's not required in some cases. So these, where I've said there's something is complete, it's mostly because I've used a little bit of discretion. I am going to pull up the appendix now just to get a sense. And the ones where I've said that, noted that there's something is ongoing, it's because I'm aware of work that is continuing. I also want to say that I can't speak or represent city staff in other divisions, so I'm just going to provide those updates where I am aware or where staff have provided me with some information. So this is, sorry about that. So this is the appendix I've pulled up on the screen, and this lists the item, and for your convenience, I've also linked every item. So if you're interested in getting more information, I've linked not only the original item, but also if there's a related motion. So where an item did go to executive, it will be noted there. So the first item that I noted as, as partially complete and is ongoing is accessible communication at meetings. And the reason that I say that it's partially complete is that work continues on this item. So recently, my colleague Yin, who's in the room, and you feel free to add as I'm going along if you have, if I'm forgetting something. Yin gave a great presentation to our interdivisional staff team, which is staff across the organization on access and equity. So it's a interdivisional staff team on access and equity. Yin gave an excellent presentation on accessible meetings and accessible public engagement. And we've also been developing guidelines and tips, including resources and tools for staff. So some of this has already been established, but the reason I say it's ongoing is because work is still happening. We are going to finalize those guidelines and looking to improve them and maybe, and formalize them in a way. So that's why that one is still ongoing. The next one, the bylaws and policies for encroachments onto the right-of-way. This is, there's two items actually here that are related. It's also DI 16.3, private ramps on public rights right-of-way. So Transportation Services came and spoke to us and then they came back. So the update on this is that a stakeholder workshop was conducted on June 5th of this year. I know I did send out an invitation to members of this committee. So Transportation Services is actively working on this. They received input and feedback from the workshop, and they are in the process of evaluating and summarizing. I know they are working with some external researchers. I don't want to speak for them, but I know that there was researchers involved, and they will be presenting the results of the workshop and recommendations that came out of it in the fall. So we can expect a report, an update on the ramps in the fall of this year. And those ramps I'm talking about are the stopgap type of ramps. So they're interim ramps. There's lots of considerations around licensing, around guidelines. Should Toronto have guidelines? Transportation Services has looked at, what are other municipalities doing? What are the best practices? So that we can look forward to in the fall. Okay. And then just going along. The abuse and misuse of accessible parking permits. This one, I've also indicated that it's partially complete. Well, it isn't complete in the sense that the request was made, and so the direction was made. This is a very complex item. There's some jurisdictional considerations. There's, I know we were waiting at one point for the results of a provincial review. So understanding that accessible parking permit program is a provincial program, and it's outside of our jurisdiction. And then the enforcement of parking permit, or the enforcement regarding abuse, is the jurisdiction of law enforcement. And where the city has a role is in the bylaw. So where the city has certain exemptions for holders of parking permits, accessible parking permits. So part of the challenge is, looking at the way the motion was written, it was, there's just some jurisdictional challenges. And I'm not sure, I do know that there have been many conversations, but I'm not exactly sure where things have landed on that. But like I said, there are some procedural conflicting areas. And I know in one of the follow-up items that went to exec, there was, I think, even a recommendation from one of the councillors to look at the feasibility of a secondary level of assessment, and a municipal level of assessment, which the province did confirm that no other municipality in Ontario has a secondary level of assessment for accessible parking permits. I also learned from the province, they did share with me that Toronto has greater or more exemptions than any other municipality, and that does cause confusion because someone comes to Toronto where they can park at an on-street parking spot that's metered and and be exempt from paying for a ticket, or they can park in a no parking zone and then they go to St. Catharines or Hamilton, and then they get a ticket, so there's some confusion. So there isn't consistency. So like I said, that is a complex item. And then the next item that I left as partially complete was the disability issues relating to policing in Toronto. It was complete in that the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee last term did have a policing working group. And then why I left it incomplete is because I don't actually know what the follow-up. I do know the request was made to the Toronto Police Board, but I don't know what was followed up. So it's complete in the sense that the request was made, which was what the motion was. Okay. Okay, I already talked about the ramps. And The next one was the festival and events funding program criteria, and this was around incorporating accessibility requirements. And I also say that that's complete because I think that the staff have responded, but I also would say that that is ongoing for a couple reasons. What I can say is that that initial motion went through our Social Development, Finance and Administration division, and we did meet with the Grants Coordinating Committee in September 2018. We made some recommendations around informing all of our grantees of their requirements to have plans, and we provided them with resources to share with all grantees. In addition, though, there's another division at the city called Economic Development and Culture, and they also have been doing some work in this area. They are currently working on developing a festival strategy, a sort of funding program. And again, I can't speak on behalf, but except for the little bit that I have learned. But they are also looking to ensure accessibility considerations within that strategy. And also, there's a Toronto Significant Investment Program that's part of economic development and culture, and they ensure that accessibility plans that outline information or initiatives are communicated and are included. So there's a requirement in the application for those accessibility requirements. Okay, the next item that I have indicated is complete, but it is ongoing, is the Forward Motion campaign. This is where a representative from Forward Motion came and gave a presentation to this committee. The outcome of that, so I say it's complete because the requests were made, the recommendations were made, and I know that it is in the hands of facilities, I believe. And I believe, and again, I can't speak, but there may be some reporting on this. Now, this is another area where it's not as straightforward as we may at first thought. There are jurisdictional concerns because there are legal requirements for the city to be consistent with the provincial legislation as well as federal legislation. And there's also concerns that if we changed signage at the city, it wouldn't be consistent with that legislation or international standards. So I think that there is research currently going on. But in terms of, I would consider it complete because the request has been made. The city has not started using the dynamic symbol of access, though, because of those jurisdictional concerns. And then employment accessibility at the City of Toronto. I'm not going to speak to this because at our last meeting, DI 2.6, there was a motion for the People, Equity and Human Rights Division to come and present on that item. So that just went to exec, I think, a week ago. So they will be now working on that. So I can't speak to that, but an update will be expected later this year. And so there was two of the outstanding items were both related to the employment strategy. And then there's another item that was part of DI 20.2. The second part of that item was relating to shelters and housing. So if you had read the motion or the item that went to exec, there was a request for consultation around shelter guidelines. So the response that Shelter Support and Housing has provided is that the development of new shelter guidelines did include a focused engagement session that occurred on March 12th, 2019. And I also we did invite former members of TAC and other members of disability communities to that meeting. So that was essentially what we requested. And the new shelter design guidelines continue to be under development, and they are planning a future opportunity to review the content with the new Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee. So prior to finalizing the document. So we can expect a report on those shelter design guidelines before they're finalized. And the second part of that was around housing applications, and in fact, the city staff did meet with stakeholders, including the RPATH, which is a committee of Toronto Community Housing, and they met with them in August of 2018, and they reviewed and approved new forms and have been working. So they have been working on that, which is great. And the only reason it's continued is because they will be returning to the committee. And the final item that I have indicated as partially complete was the Wheel-Trans appeal process. And again, we did receive a presentation from TTC at the end of end of last term, and the council did make the request to the TTC board. I cannot speak for TTC on any further action on that, as it's outside of my scope, but the request was made. So that's it for the outstanding items that I pulled out. Again, remembering that these items don't carry forward automatically. So staff aren't required to report back on all of them. However, many initiatives and projects remain ongoing, and staff will continue to work on. So that's what I have. That's the information I gathered. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know.
Deidre, thank you very much. Are there questions for Deidre? I see Stephanie's hand. Stephanie first, and then Wendy.
Thank you, Deidre. I appreciate the work that you've done there. I honestly, my questions are a bit of clarification. I honestly didn't realize that the PDF had the tabs to actually bring us. So I'm just wondering if you could just give me a very brief understanding of the corporate accessibility policy. Is that just in a very small way? And if there is a review date that you're aware of on that policy, and then I'll ask my second question later.
Sure. So just to understand, you're looking for more information on the corporate accessibility policy?
Just generally, I wasn't able to, I just realized that we had access to it, but if you can just give me like a two-liner relating to what exactly does that mean?
So that policy applies to the Toronto Public Service, and it's really a plain language, or plainer language in the legislation. It's meant to help Toronto Public Service staff understand what their obligations are. It's very much aligned with the Integrated Accessibility Standard regulation under the AODA. There are some specific things in our specific environment that it addresses. So there's an area on customer service, on communications, information and communication, on employment, on transportation, and the design of public spaces. Yes, so that's essentially what it is.
May I ask, are there guidelines that go out to the different departments, or that are available to different departments relating to when, just pertaining to some of the questions that Wendy had relating to how they were conducting surveys and consultations? Do we have something at the City of Toronto to guide departments on those kinds of issues relating to accessibility?
Yes, so some of that we have, some of that lives within the policy, some of that we have, and some of that we are developing and redeveloping. One thing that is going to be coming to you in the fall is our multi-year accessibility plan. It's something that we're working on right now, and that includes sort of the governance structure and how do we ensure that accessibility and accountability for accessibility and like the responsibility. It's not all yin and I, obviously, and how do we ensure that it's shared across the organization. So that's really what we're focusing on right now, and part of it is we do have a lot of tools, like such as the communication, how the guidelines for accessible meetings. We do have things like that. We do have some guidelines for information and communication. There's a team in IT, I call them digital accessibility, but they're called, I think, the AODA compliance project team, and they've provided some really great tools for staff and trainings, and so there are guidelines out there, but we certainly are looking at the inventory and looking at where we need to update them.
Understood. Thank you. And my last question relates to DI 17.4 and relating to festivals. And again, I'm sorry, because I didn't realize that I could click. But would these include just street festivals? I'm just very broadly, just in terms of, like, for example, Danforth or beaches, festivals, things like that? Is that sort of?
So I actually don't know if I can actually answer that 100 confidently, because it's hard even within the city, because there's 44 divisions.
No, so
I don't know who's.
So I'm going to ask another question then. Is that something we can revisit? I'm asking because I'm realizing that maybe there's a way that they must have to apply for a permit to run these festivals, and then maybe at that point we can also provide accessibility or the understanding of having individuals from different communities. I'm just realizing that it's not necessarily consistent from year to year. I don't know if this was more of a commentary now. I'm sorry if I move into comments, but only because I had, in my own area, for example, I had volunteered last year thinking, okay, all those accessibility initiatives would then be brought over into the next year, and I realized, okay, it's a very who's working the next year kind of thing, and whether or not, some easy, simple tips that people could, have consistency on. That's the reason I was asking.
I mean, it would depend on who's funding the festival, and so I can, if you give me offline,
BIA,
you can.
like the
BIA. So again, I'd have to get more details about.
Yeah.
Is it economic development culture? Is it social development, finance, and administration? Depending on where the funding's coming from, might be a different.
Got it.
But certainly we would expect that accessibility considerations are always considered as in any festival that we are sponsoring or funding in any way.
Again, if it's something that we could think about as a group, if people are willing to maybe look at that item closer. Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you. Our next member to question is Wendy, then Michael McNeely, and then Jason. Okay.
Thanks, Deidre, for the presentation. It's a lot of work to go through all that stuff, so I really appreciate that you've done that. I wanted to just ask a little bit about the process of updating the committee on some of these kinds of items. So, and it's a little bit of a comment here, but there is a question too, so bear with me. Some of these items are marked complete because the request was made, not because we have any sense of whether the request was met or accommodated, and we don't know what the follow-up is. So for example, one of the ones for me that stands out is around the poverty reduction strategy, which is something of critical importance for people with disabilities in the City of Toronto. The recommendations that were made from this committee were that people with disabilities were largely invisible in the poverty reduction strategy, which has a dramatic impact on the lived experience of many people with disabilities who are living in poverty. And we made those recommendations as marked as complete in your list, but we don't know whether those recommendations have been taken on board or not. So we don't know whether the Poverty Reduction Strategy Office has taken what we said and integrated that into the document and into the recommendations and significantly into the plan. So I wonder if you have any suggestions on how the process of updating the committee. Also, I wanted to note, just before I move into the question, it's understandable, but it's also disappointing that the things that come up before the election don't get carried forward. And I guess that's part of the nature of what we're dealing with in terms of there being term limits, et cetera, et cetera. But, for things to just be knocked off of the list that are considered significant by the people on the committee with no carry forward is very hard to reconcile. Also, with all of us being here and really wanting to provide our expertise and our time to improve accessibility at the city, and then to see things kind of marked as complete when we really don't know if they have been accomplished. So do you have any recommendations from where you sit? And I wonder if it's something just more broadly that could be thought about in the context of the committee around how updating committee members could be improved and how maybe some of these items could be carried forward in a more consistent fashion so that we know that when we're making comments that we hope to improve systems and plans, for example, that they're actually being taken into consideration and we have some sense of the circle being closed. That's a really long.
No, thank you for that. I think, so I guess maybe just a little bit of clarification. And I'm saying, like, technically speaking, things maybe not. I think that most of the Toronto Public Service, most of the items, that's why I left them open, because I know I'm aware of ongoing work. I think that in good faith, that the staff are taking the recommendations, and just because it's a new term, doesn't mean everything gets dropped, and maybe I spoke out of turn a bit in saying that, but I was trying to explain why I was saying that they were completed, because it was hard for me to figure out. It took me quite a little bit of time to figure out how to decide what items I was going to talk about when there was 119. So I may have spoke out of turn, and I'm sorry if I did that, but I do think that staff are still going to continue, especially on things of importance. And I think that the committee has an opportunity to request updates. I think one of my recommendations, before I say that, I just want to say the poverty reduction piece, because I didn't mention it, it was complete because the request was for a presentation, and the presentation did come. And at the last meeting of this committee this term, there was a request, I believe, for poverty reduction to come back. I have been in touch with the poverty reduction team, and they are planning on returning this year. So I have had that conversation. So there will be, that's why I didn't address that one particularly, because I knew that they will be coming. I guess my recommendation really would be to, when there is a motion, to ask for follow-up. So when there is an item, that a report back be made to this committee. And I do, we can, in our team, do our best to follow up with staff and ask for updates. But sometimes the scale is large, or the scope is large and beyond. But I think that's one way, would be to say when you're asking for a report, or when a division comes and gives you a presentation on something, and the committee gives a lot of feedback, and the motion might be something like, please incorporate the feedback of this committee into your strategy, then asking and report back maybe in the fall or in the next quarter. So that would probably be, that's the one that comes to mind first.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Our next member to question is Michael McNeely.
I would like to make a motion to request that we have a staff member, whoever is responsible, present to us at a future meeting about festivals and festival accessibility. And I think we can incorporate Kristen One-Tam's parade recommendation in there as well, because I think that's a festival. But I think we need more education and awareness about what we can do with regards to festivals. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Our next member to question is Jason.
Thank you. So my question's kind of already been covered by Wendy, but as a follow-up, I might just ask Deirdre. So I know we've said that some of the initiatives that were ongoing before the election weren't just dropped, that people are still working on them, although they don't technically have to be working on them. Is there a way to get a sense for exactly which initiatives are still ongoing and which ones perhaps have been discontinued due to the election? Is there a way to find that out? Thanks.
So in terms of the 119 items that came to TAC, I did my very best to identify the ones that I knew there was ongoing work going on, and the ones that I felt, based on the review I did, that I felt that they had been achieved. Things that are outside of my scope, such as wheel trans, is really outside of something that I can provide an update on, or police matters is something that I can't, it would be a little bit out of my scope, but I did do my very best to pull out what I knew where I knew work was continuing. If you want, I mean, if you want updates on each item, that would be separate requests to staff, that on each item. So I think it would be, maybe my recommendation would be to look at those items that, that you are most concerned with or you find most interesting, and maybe there make the request for staff to give an update on those particular ones. Because I can't speak for all staff. I really did my best to do some research and get some follow-up on items I knew were outstanding. And like I said, I used my best discretion I could to indicate that I felt that they were sufficiently complete from where I stand.
It's a very comprehensive report, and I know it's taking a long time. The other thing I just thought about was the former working groups that have now been disbanded from the previous session. I recall when I was reviewing some of the meetings from last year prior to the election, some of the working groups still had some outstanding items of things that they were trying to work through, but were essentially going to table it till the next term. Now that the working groups are no more, what would have become of some of the issues they were working on that they may have tabled to a later date? Do you have a sense of that?
I think I would need to know more specifics. There's nothing stopping members from looking at the minutes. They are all publicly available. And if there is something that you feel needs to be raised, to write a letter to the committee, that if there's something specific, if there's a specific, I might be able to give an answer, but I don't know.
Well, I recall that you mentioned the police working group. I recall at the last meeting that they were going to try and organize some sort of a town hall or an event, but the time was running out. They felt they couldn't do it before the term ended, so that was going to be tabled.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, I mean, again, I don't want to speak out of turn around the working groups, but it's really about the procedure, the simplified procedures for council advisory bodies, and they apply to all advisory bodies to council, and there are certain procedures. One of the problems with that event was that it was, well, there were problems because it was too close to the election, and that was a conflict, but because there's rules around election time and using staff resources. There's also an issue because it was a meeting of the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee, it would have had to be clerked in the same way. It would have had to be, the structure would have to be the same. So I think that's what I recall, and I don't know if someone from clerks wants to speak to that further, but that was something that was not going to be permitted under the simplified rules of procedure for council advisory.
Thank you. Another member to question, Michael McSheely.
Hi.
On. There we go, perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Deidre, for all of the hard work that you've done. And I was the one that gave you all this extra work, though. And so thank you for doing it. And I was going to say, I think the impetus for me was, I remember we had that one presentation from Gord Brown, who was here, who had basically said, oh, I've been here before, I brought up all of these concerns, and it was basically about the bike lanes, and yet nothing has really happened. And so for me, that was the impetus. It's like, well, wait a sec, I don't really know what's been done before, and I actually felt quite badly that he had come, and I couldn't really sort of answer to anything about his recommendations. So what I was going to say, just as a couple of things, number one, so you've got 112 items that are completed, and it says 3 ongoing, 7 partially completed items, 6 ongoing. So there's basically 9 ongoing items from that appendix. And so some of them, as Stephanie had mentioned, were related to festivals. What are the ones that that we can make requests for people to come back and report on? Because I'm thinking that may be something to make it easier to say, and I don't know if we can do it by the end of our term in 2019, but we can say, by early 2020 or during the 2020 year, we'd like those individuals or groups to come back and present on what they've done.
Well, certainly, I I pulled them out. They're in the appendix, identified in the appendix. I think I know poverty reduction is planning on coming back.
Yeah.
I know that the transportation services is planning on coming back around the right-of-way, the ramps on the right-of-way. You may want, you could still have a motion to make sure that happens, certainly, or, I mean, I can't make the suggestions to you. I can say that, I've identified them, and where you feel like you'd like an update, we could certainly, that.
But some of the ones that have gone off to executive, I would have no idea how long that takes for executive to decide. I think you had mentioned one or two of them went to executive.
Yeah, so in the appendix also is identified, the motion, when it's gone to exec, it's identified there.
Okay.
And the decision of exec. And it's also identified if it's gone to council.
So out of those, how many then would we still have as outstanding then, that we could make those requests? So festivals would be one, and then how many of the other ones could TAC members make that request of?
Michael, maybe I can help out. I'm working with the clerks right now to create one motion that will capture all the outstanding items to ask the staff to report back on them through the balance of our term.
Okay.
Would that be, I mean, do you drive?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I just feel a little bit, it's not my place to suggest which ones should be requested or not. I have highlighted ones where I know there's ongoing work.
Yep.
And those are the 9 that I've identified as ongoing.
And I think they'd be a good starting point, just to make sure that they get carried through.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. One more question? Okay, we're gonna move into the speaking order. If you have a question, let's wrap it up here, and then we're gonna move into speaking. Stephanie, final member to question, unless any other hands are going up. Okay, Stephanie, go ahead.
Thank you. I know you had mentioned that the working groups that that we don't have any longer. I also just wanted to know whether or not the items that we are looking at also are looking at items that the working groups might have brought forward as items, that's all, that need to be maybe looked at again or continued or brought forward. Because unfortunately, again, it looks like there were a lot of groups that maybe they had specific items, I don't know.
Yes, certainly. I think like DI 20.2 is an example of those were working group updates. 2 very significant motions came out of them, and they went on to executive. So they then, the one around employment strategy and the one around consultation around the shelter design guidelines. So those came out of working group meetings. I guess what I would say is that many times the working groups would meet, and there's other people in the room who maybe even can speak to this, Yin and Wendy particularly. So the working groups would come up, and then there would be a motion, and the motion would be maybe attached to the working group updates, but then it would come back as a presentation. So in most cases, if there was a motion that came out of a working group, it would come back to the next meeting as a different item, like so with the title as what the item was. Am I capturing that correctly?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move into the speaking portion. We're going to start with Michael McNeely.
I just wanted to recommend that this presentation, or at least the PowerPoint, be incorporated in all orientation packages for new members in the next 5 years. I think it's a great snapshot of what the committee has done for 4 years, and I think it can be a template for future presentations of its type. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Anyone else to speak? Okay, Michael McChelly. We're going to need Michael McChelly's microphone on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Wendy's got it. I was just wondering, just as a suggestion to throw out there, maybe at the end of each calendar year, actually come up with like a checklist to basically say, okay, what has been accomplished, and create like a roadmap, like what's still left outstanding, and then that way we'll have an idea. And I think it'll be helpful for the committee, so then, for us, but also going forward in future committees to sort of know what has happened and maybe a formal process for it.
Okay, Michael, thank you.
Thanks, I think that's a great idea, and I think Yin and I have also spoken about how do we, develop a work plan for the limited time, and it's so valuable, this time together, and how do we try and focus it in the way that is going to be most effective. And so we've had these conversations, and I think that's a good place to start. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Stephanie to speak?
Thank you very much. And so this is just a comment, just from an observational comment, in no way, shape, or form. Please take anything personally. I'm just wondering, and I guess this is because this is my first year at the committee, and when I was looking at the types of subcommittees that we had previously, I'm wondering whether or not the change in having to have all meetings taped and through the clerk's office has impeded the work of this group, and I don't know. I'm just, I can only tell you that I know that these are all very complicated issues from a personal standpoint that I've worked on throughout my life, and each one of those items does seem like a systemic issues that should be dealt with from our community standpoint. So I guess I just wonder if other advisory committees as well, and this is a general ask, but it can also just be a comment, would have how they have now utilized, or if they've come up with another approach, that they could still have pointed discussions around specific issues that pertain to the community. And I'd also would welcome comments from the committee, please, to see how the hell you feel about that. Thank you.
I can say, I can't speak about the other committees at all. And do you mean committees of council within the City of Toronto council structure, or do you mean committees in other jurisdictions? I don't.
Well, I would assume just City of Toronto, because we wouldn't, those were the only places that the guidelines would be subject to.
So maybe someone from clerks can answer that. I do want to say, though, that what has been happening this term so far, and this is our third meeting, is that.
Sorry, Deidre, the question and answer period is over.
Okay.
Now it's just for staff to provide advice.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry, for the committee members to provide advice.
Okay.
If you want to just finish that final.
Oh, I was just going to say that there have been letters, many letters have come in from members. And so they are, I would suggest that they are fulfilling very much the same role as what the communications we received previously from working groups was doing.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else to speak? Okay, Wendy, please go ahead.
Super quick. I just wanted to say thank you. I know it's been a ton of work to put all of that together, to you and to Yin, and in putting it together and bringing it to the committee. It helps us to feel useful to know what the follow-up is on some of these items, so thank you for that. I think it would serve as a really great template, as has been mentioned already by committee members here, in terms of the orientation materials, and in terms of, as committees change membership, there's a way of being able to work through some of that, the threads of where things are kind of moving forward, and where maybe incoming committee members want to focus their attention. But mainly, just thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else to speak? Okay, then I would just take a moment to just move a motion and also just deliver some remarks. I will read the motion, and the clerks can put the motion onto the screen, that the Executive Committee requests the Executive Director of People, Equity and Human Rights to consult with the appropriate city officials on requests made by the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee during the 2014-2018 term that were identified as partially implemented or ongoing in Appendix A, in order to coordinate presentations to the committee during 2019 and 2020. The actual items will be itemized in the full body of the motion moving forward. We just didn't get that in the interest of time. Lots of words. And also just to echo the thanks of the committee to Deidre and Yin, I recognize that this particular division is very, very small. You are tasked with providing, being our conduit between the committee and the rest of the Toronto Public Service, starting with Executive Committee and City Council. It is a huge responsibility to try to get everyone to do the right thing. Even if they have good intentions, but unless the protocols and the structures of how we govern change, the outcome is not going to be there. So I just want to commend staff for this incredible body of work, and also to take what we oftentimes start off with conversations and ideas to then make it into something that actually interfaces with the public bureaucratic side in a way that actually makes sense to them. I want to just highlight the fact that there are a number of issues that were raised in your report that I think the fact that it doesn't necessarily fall neatly into one jurisdiction means that we sit in limbo. Whether it's around the issues of disabilities, people living with disabilities and policing, or perhaps the permit parking issue, which I probably get some form of communication from various stakeholders about every other month, and I can't find a resolution, tells me that we're going to have to figure out who owns it. And to me, I'm perfectly happy if the City of Toronto does as much of the ownership as possible, because if we're not going to get the support necessarily in a timely fashion from the province, or perhaps even by the Toronto Police, it just means that we need to do more and be much more innovative, because this is the one order of government that is, I think, as the most accessible. And that means that we're going to have to really think outside the box. It's not any judgment to the presentation that was delivered from staff, but it's really not acceptable that simply because it falls outside of our jurisdiction, we kind of let the conversation fall there. Because the impact for people who are living with the outcome is very harmful. And I cannot think of any other issue that we have raised at the committee and not gotten outcomes. And I think that if we sort of went back even 2010 to 2014 and perhaps 2006 to 2010, I suspect some of those outstanding issues have been rolling forward term after term. So if there's a way for us to literally own it and address it here, with all the resources that we have at the city and the political influence that we have and the political muscle we have at the city, I think we're going to be better off. And then finally, I just want to recognize that there were 119 items, 25 of them were transportation related. I did a quick count, and I did it again just to make sure I got it right. At least 8 of them, I think, are TTC specific related items. And we're going to have a conversation shortly afterwards in terms of the role that TAC has with respect to advice to the TTC, and whether or not it should most be addressed here or if it's addressed at ACAT. But I do want to recognize that those 25 transportation items, out of those 25, 8 of them are TTC related. Out of the 119 items that this committee has deliberated over, or perhaps initiated, it is quite significant considering that this committee originally, prior to 2014, only met once every quarter. So it meant, so we changed our meeting structure in 2014 to meet more regularly, and we wanted to elevate the work of the committee because we wanted everyone to know that this committee existed, that the different divisions of the city could tap into this committee. And I would say that as an outcome of some operational changes here, we have achieved that, but we still have a long ways to go. And then, of course, finally, to thank the committee members. Every single one of those 119 items had your fingerprints and voice prints on them. So we recognize that that's a lot of work for you as well. Thank you very much. Are there any questions of the mover of the motion? Okay, seeing none, maybe we could take a vote on the motion. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. And thank you very much, Deidre, for your staff presentation. Before we move on to item number 5, I would like to introduce a new item. It's a letter from Michael Misuse. It has been circulated. It is, oh no, actually, we need to introduce it before we can circulate it. Michael, would you like to just quickly introduce the motion that you would like us to see?
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Councillor Wong-Tam. Very briefly, sort of the summary is that the City of Toronto has hosted various public events in recognition of Seniors Month, Pride. There's been an Indigenous sunrise ceremony. However, there has not been any indication of a public event recognizing people with disabilities. So my request is to explore the feasibility of a public event in recognition of International Day of People with Disabilities. And so the recommendation is that the Executive Committee requests that the Executive Director of People, Equity and Human Rights to explore the feasibility, as I had mentioned, and to report to the next meeting of the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee on September the 26th. And the ideas of this report, sort of a preliminary exploration, is just to sort of identify some key themes and or topics of interest, like employment for people with disabilities. And the idea is to liaise with like-minded organizations like the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto and sort of look into the idea of having a joint event or information fair either on or around December the 3rd.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much. All those in favor of introducing this as a new item, and we'll have that motion circulated. Okay, any opposed? That carries. Thank you. So we'll get that in front of the committee members, and that will be item number 6. Moving back to item number 5, the request for update on the Wheel-Trans appeal process. We held this item in Michael's name. Michael, do you want to speak? Because there's no TTC staff for you to ask questions of here.
That's okay. So basically, just really quickly, on June 20th, 2018, the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee received information from the project lead customer service and assistant manager customer service from Wheel-Trans on an update to the Wheel-Trans appeal process. During that course of the meeting, the committee made several requests for accessibility and communication improvements, as well as to confirm from Wheel-Trans that all customers with conditional eligibility are still eligible for door-to-door service until such time that the conventional TTC is fully accessible in 2025. And even what was interesting about going back to that meeting in June of 2018, there was sort of a request made that that in the first quarter of 2019, that there be sort of an update on that. And I think the whole idea, based on my letter, is the fact that you know, the committee had some concerns about the appeal process, especially for the requirement that customers with disabilities would have to make an in-person appeal. There was discussion of having some sort of technological solutions, like having people either use Zoom or Skype to make the appeal. And so it was just really to sort of track that process to see if that had been brought up. The other thing too, in terms of my letter, is that the Wheel-Trans is in the process of having all existing customers get reassessed for their eligibility, and apparently that's starting this fall. And the idea is just to see that is done in an equitable fashion.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to this particular item? Yes, Stephanie, please go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to mention, and I guess that one of the things that Councillor has pointed to was relating to the whether or not we should be involved in TTC matters, since they do have a committee dealing with it. I know that that they have, we are invited to go and to listen to and go to their meetings as well, where we probably would be able to comment. But I just wonder whether or not we have the knowledge and the in-depth experience that for example, I think that that's why there is a separate committee relating to that, and I think that probably I personally think that we might not want to interfere with that committee's purview. That's my field,
Thank you, Stephanie. Wendy, to speak as well?
I just wanted to say something in support of Michael's request, and I think there's a discussion to be had here, and I don't know when we have it, because I think at the moment
This is
it. Okay, so comments on it. There are jurisdictional questions, and I think that some of those are coming up for discussion. But I would be really concerned if what we're saying is that this committee has no place discussing transit-related issues. Because if we say that, it's a jurisdictional issue and it all sits within ACAT, then this committee effectively is having no say and no role in terms of discussing issues that impact people with disabilities related to transportation in the City of Toronto. And that would be a massive chunk of the lived experience that falls then outside of the purview of this committee. And I find that troubling, that consideration to be quite troubling. In particular because, as the executive director of the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto, a number of the concerns that I hear about from people with disabilities relate directly to transportation. Without accessible transportation, we are not in a position to have a job or to go shopping or to have a social life. So those kinds of things do impact broadly and quite seriously on the kinds of experiences that people have with everything else in terms of moving around and engaging in the City of Toronto. So I wanted to say that I support asking for them to come back and discuss this, particularly in the context of the reassessment process that Michael spoke about there just briefly. I heard about it because Michael had a copy of the Wheel-Trans users newsletter, but I have seen nothing else in terms of official communications about this. And I was quite public in terms of my concerns the last time they were here about this being an exercise to get people off of the system. And I really think that that means that it is something that is broadly impactful in terms of people with disabilities in the City of Toronto. And I would welcome the opportunity to hear from folks from the TTC here at the committee.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Anyone else to speak? I would like to invite Deidre to perhaps provide some comment in terms of governance.
Yeah, I think everything that's been said is very valuable. I think from my perspective and where I sit and within the accessibility team in the TP into Toronto Public Service, there's 44 divisions and there's so much work to be done within all of our divisions. I recognize there's a lot of transportation issues even within Toronto Public Service, transportation matters. One of the key things about this in our terms of reference is really about the alignment of this committee with the city's multi-year accessibility plan. So where I guess I struggle a little bit is that TTC is completely outside of the city's accessibility plan. The TTC reports directly to the province and maintains their own multi-year accessibility plan. I also want to acknowledge, and I don't think that necessarily I would say flat out we should never, and that's not what I'm suggesting, never, but I also want to acknowledge the important work that the Advisory Committee on Accessible Transit does. Having had the opportunity to participate, and Ian as well, in the recruitment process and in watching their processes, I've learned a lot. They meet every month. In addition to every month, they meet. They have working groups that meet in addition. So I feel that they're very engaged, and I want to be I think that I would hope that we respect the work that's being done, because a lot of time and effort is going into that committee, from what I have seen. I think that's all I would like to. That's just where I see. Not that there's not intersections, but I do feel that there's so much work that the city needs to talk to this committee about, and we only meet 6 times a year. So that's all.
Thank you very much, Deidre, for the feedback and the advice. I want to just recognize that Mazen Aribi is here. He is obviously the chair of ACAT for the TTC. Mazen, if I recall, you've been coming to our meetings since I've become chair in 2014, and you've never addressed the committee once. Because we're now having this particular conversation about the TTC, do you have anything in particular to add?
Thank you for the opportunity. So I can weigh in about what I heard today. So I agree with what says about ACAT is a specialized committee that deals deep with all the issues about accessible transit. As mentioned here, we have 4 subcommittees that each subcommittee get into more details. However, we always value any comment from the public out there, especially TAC members. They always have good advice and all that. And we established a working group between your committee and our committee. For example, every time there's a meeting, we send you ahead of time the agenda of the meeting, the material, the approved agenda, and we always invite you to attend should you have something to contribute. We also have, we do receive deputations from the public should anybody want to have a specific issue to bring up, and we encourage that too. Coming here as an observer for many years, I have an idea what this committee wants to address, and I think we do take it back and we discuss it at ACAT. I'll give you an example about what it says last year about the appeal process. We looked at that and we feel that an in-person interview would work better than having an interview via Skype or other methods. And to accommodate, for the purpose of accommodating, we are willing to have alternative interview date should the person unable to attend. We also, with the Wheel-Trans, will also don't change the eligibility status until the interview met. And we also provide rides to and from the customer's place to the interview location. Again, should the committee feel that still there's a need for staff to come and give details, you're welcome to make that recommendation. And again, I invite you again, please attend our meetings and see if there's anything that you can learn and we can learn from you, and vice versa.
Thank you very much, Mazen. I see we have a special guest visitor, a former TAC committee member, but also, I believe, a current TTC commissioner, Councillor Carroll. Oh, okay. Did you want to address, I'm sure you probably didn't hear the entire discussion, but are you interested in speaking to the committee? We're sort of, it's a little bit informal at this point in time. Okay, okay, great. Thank you very much. Is there anyone who's interested in speaking to the item? Okay. Michael, go ahead. I know you probably need to respond.
Well, I was just going to ask a quick question about, maybe for Mazen, about the working group. Like, is there somebody on who's TAC who's also on ACAT as well, or is there somebody from ACAT also on TAC? Because I'm thinking TAC members can go to meetings, but then unless they're making like a formal deputation, I'm just not sure how it's working as a two-way street, though.
Yes, please go ahead, Mazen. You may be the best person to respond to these questions right now.
So again, recently we strengthened our relationship between TAC and ACAT. So that's why I mentioned earlier, we do send all the materials to you, yes, and we do receive your materials, and we distribute it to our members. So it's a two-way learning, cooperation, whatever you want to call it. The idea is, again, we don't want any good advice to go away. We take every good advice in consideration and we pass it to staff. Just a reminder, we all work together on this. So that's a fact.
I'm just wondering, should we have a TAC member also on ACAT's board as well, and an ACAT member on our board? Do you think that would be helpful?
So having said that, you said that, I would like to invite any member, whether from TAC or the public, to apply for ACAT, as we are recruiting new members. There are two information sessions will be held in this room and committee room 2 on July 26 from 1 to 2:30. It's a Wednesday. And you can double check the
Wednesday one is in.
The Wednesday meeting is the later, which is 7 to 8:30, July 26th, and the Friday, July 31st, is from 2 to 3:30.
And Mason, we can also help recirculate that information for the committee members.
Yes, sure.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Michael? Okay. Is there anyone else who would be interested in speaking to the item? No? Okay, so we have a motion before us, and maybe I can just take a moment to speak to it. I recognize that this committee is tasked with obviously providing support to and advice, strategic advice to City Council, and by way of City Council to the City Manager's Office and to the Toronto Public Service. I do recognize that what we have before us is a huge, ambitious body of work that we completed in 2019, and I oftentimes recall that some of our meetings were rushed. As we sort of got to 12:30, everybody was starting to, they had to leave. There were times where we thought we might lose quorum because of Wheel-Trans or other accommodations to be made. And there were a few items where we had to defer. If you recall, we couldn't always finish the agenda before us just because we didn't want to shortchange the staff presentations that were here. We wanted to have the full discussion that we needed to have every single item. At the same time, there were times where staff were invited to appear before us to do the presentation, where they sat through almost 4 hours and we couldn't accommodate them, and we asked them to come back in 2 months. We end up losing a little bit of momentum on the work that we have to do as the committee. And I do recognize that transportation is absolutely, along with employment and housing and health, is one of some of the biggest key strategic topics that we review as a committee. I'm encouraged, Mason, by the reinforced relationship that's come out of TAC as well as ACAT. I also do recognize that if we wanted to send Michael's letter to you, and perhaps you as the chair take this before ACAT, that is also a consideration. You can just sort of nod if you think this is doable. But I also want to recognize that we haven't been able to necessarily complete the work that we have here. And there's been times where out of the 8 TTC reported, out of the 25 transportation items, some of them get into the very granular bus routes, where there may be a particular member that has a particular, that made an observation, but the rest of us don't necessarily have the same level of expertise to comment on that very granular issue. And of course, more importantly than that, we actually don't oftentimes have the TTC staff here to respond. So it does end up slowing down the process, because by the time we initiate a request, it literally is 2 months out before it goes off to, it goes to the committee, then it goes to council, then it goes to the TTC. And we don't know if it's already on their agenda. Perhaps it's work in progress that they have, and then for them to report back. I'm not sure if I don't believe it's actually become the most efficient way for us to build ongoing strategic relationships with ACAT, but more importantly, getting the outcome that we want in a timely fashion. What I'd like to do with the indulgence of the committee, I'd like to refer this letter from Michael to Mason as a chair to bring this before his committee, but I also want to work with the committee members on how can we further strengthen our relationship with ACAT and formalize that. And perhaps what we can do is maybe even co-sponsor the very next recruitment process with ACAT to make sure we get even more folks from the TAC community into ACAT. And see if we can formalize something that is a little bit more structured. Because at some point in time, we're going to have to make a decision. Are we going to continue the process that we have, or do we focus on the task that we have literally been tasked with the 44 divisions across the city? And that's not to say that transportation is not important. It absolutely is. Right-of-way management, the trail systems, the sidewalk widths, the curbside management, the bike lanes, the accessibility on and on issues, all that related to roads and sidewalks, that's still here. The TTC piece perhaps is best left with the ACAT community. Who's actually meeting much more regularly and getting much more deep into the weeds than when we ever could, because when a TTC item comes before this committee, I think at most we have probably given it at tops maybe 1 hour of consideration. Whereas I'm not sure how long your meetings are, but I suspect it goes into much more detail. I'll just correct myself. Unless there are some really big highlighted changes, then maybe we tackle those ones, but the day-to-day items perhaps not so. I know, Wendy, you're itching to respond to my comments. Why don't we get you in here?
I'm a bit concerned because this feels like a jurisdictional spat that is working against the broader accountability of the changes that the TTC is looking to implement. So I don't understand why there would be so much resistance to asking the TTC to come and talk to us, a committee that's also engaged on accessibility issues and who bring, slightly different expertise to this issue, I think, in terms of different people sitting at the table. I don't understand why there is such resistance. It feels a bit like there's an avoidance mechanism to come and talk about this process that is actually going to impact everybody. So everybody who's on Wheel-Trans is going to have to go through this very significant, and actually, if the past is to be, viewed as setting the precedent for the future, quite a troubling process of requalifying, not always in line with dignity, not always supporting people with disabilities to be viewed as people of value. There's a lot to answer for in terms of this re-qualification process. There's a huge amount of anxiety in the community. And if this is just another place for them to come and talk about it and tell us why they have to go through this and give us a little bit of reassurance around that, I don't understand why there would be resistance to that. I think it would be in their best interest to be able to come to another forum, obviously very engaged, of people with disabilities, and give us, the inside scoop on why this is something that's necessary for the functioning, and also some reassurances so that we can go back to our community members and reassure them that their dignity and their right to accessing transportation will also be centered in the conversation as these things proceed. At the moment, I don't feel very reassured about that because it does feel like there's a lot of resistance to having them come here. So I wanted to throw that back out to the committee. And I'm not entirely sure that I'm happy with referring the letter to ACAT at this point. I'd rather see what our committee members have to say about whether or not, as a committee, the TAC committee, do we want to request the TTC to come and talk to us about the appeals process and the re-qualification process here, and in the interest of just open communications in terms of supporting people with disabilities to understand where they sit with some of these systems.
Thank you very much. Michelle.
Thank you, Wendy. I was thinking along similar lines. I believe that for issues like you said, Councillor Wong-Tam, that are granular and about specific bus routes, absolutely that seems like the purview of ACAT. But something at this level truly will affect our communities greatly, and people won't be able to go to public meetings and give feedback on issues if they can't get there. And re-registering, re-qualifying is going to be a time of great upheaval for most folks that use our services. So I'd really like to give feedback on behalf of that community on this particular issue. I just think its scope is so large, and I think we do have the ability to give a pretty specialized expertise and then work together with ACAT. I think for not smaller issues, obviously every issue is large, but for more focused transportation issues, I really appreciate that ACAT exists. But for something along the lines of reevaluating and having to re-register and having to prove your disability and that you're disabled enough to use a service you've already had access to for however long, I think that is within our scope, personally. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you. Jason, please.
So, thank you. Just to echo that, I don't view this issue as being necessarily that we have to be in silos and be separate. I think there are, as everyone's saying, larger issues where both committees can act and have some jurisdiction if they're going to affect the community as a whole, not just specific granular issues. So I would echo the sentiments that on the broader issues, such as a requalification issue, that's something that I would think that would extend to the purview of both committees. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Michael McNeely.
I second everything that's already been mentioned. I don't think we should be in silos either. Representing the deaf community, we have some issues with how public transport is allocated and how information is relayed, and I think we can also discuss that here in this committee. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else? Michael, again?
I can just say one thing very quickly. At that June 20th, 2018 meeting, we did have a TAC member, at that time a former TAC member, Terry Lynn Langdon, who did write a letter expressing a lot of the concerns that she had with conditional eligibility. So again, she did present at TAC. I don't necessarily know all the details as to why she presented at TAC and say not at ACAT, but I do believe it was a comfort level where she felt that she was able to come forward here and share her concerns, where for whatever reason she may not have felt as safe or as comfortable presenting to ACAT. I think the other thing too, though, that I think we need to look at is this upcoming reassessment of all Wheel-Trans customers is being done well in advance of the 2025 deadline of making the entire TTC fully accessible. And just echoing the point of concern is that a lot of community members feel that they're being rushed all of a sudden in terms of this reassessment when there's a lot of work done for the TTC to be fully accessible.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Anyone else before we wrap up? Okay. I'm actually not going to refer this to the chair. I mean, after hearing the will of the committee, I think that what has transpired, I believe, is a very helpful conversation. I suspect that we all have a sharper idea of what we should be tasked with and what we should be working with ACAT on. I want to thank Mason for your contributions, and you want to speak again? Is that what I'm seeing? Go ahead, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with what says here. We, as an advisory committee, we provide advice to the staff, to the TTC. We are we are providing advice to the new initiative, which is the 10-year Wheel-Trans strategy, which the TTC did come here to this committee and listen to the feedback. And also going forward with all the new initiatives coming, the TTC do have town halls, information sessions, and it's being publicly on the website available. The next one is July 23, which take details into what is coming. And I encourage the members to attend that, July 23rd, at Metro Hall. And should you need feedback or an official presentation from staff, sure, please, you're welcome to request that and get advice directly from TTC. And finally, I echo what it says here, and we all gotta work together to provide the best advice. Thank you.
Great, Mason, thank you very much. Just to complete my thought, the discussion here, I believe, is excellent. I think it helps us sharpen our pencil of what we need to do and what we need to focus on. Perhaps as chair, what I need to do is limit our agenda, because quite honestly, there's a lot that's being asked of this committee, and we have to do it in a very short period of time to make sure that we can get everything in between 9:30 and 12:30. And oftentimes, even this discussion today took about 45 minutes, which I think is a very good use of our time. But I don't want to disrespect people's efforts in wanting to come before the committee. I know that as the chair, I've written to all the divisions inviting them to present to us on work that is in development so that we can, in advance, provide them with strategic feedback to make sure that the voices of those living with disabilities are included into that sort of broader strategic structural thinking. So there's going to be some decisions that will have to be made on who gets onto the agenda and who does not. Or we may have to expand our number of meetings once again. Which was already a big strategic move, and I'll have to do that in consultation with our clerk staff to find out whether or not there will be support for that. But nevertheless, these are all things that I believe that I'm now tasked with, and I will work with Deidre to make sure that we try to accommodate all who wants to appear before this committee with the resources and the staff time that we have, and still be able to hopefully give very rich feedback back to the city manager, the TPS, the Toronto Public Service, as well as to the executive committee and city council. Not impossible, but just means a little bit more work for us. The motion before us is from Michael Micheli. You have it before you. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Thank you. And then finally, one last item, and we are going to make this meeting, end this meeting on time. Point 6, this was the new item of business that was added. And Michael, I'm advised by the clerk that, that they would like you to read the recommendation once again. For those who need a physical copy, please let us know. We'll print that out for you.
Is this D13?
D16, the last one. This is around the international... Oh, 7, D17. This is around the International Day of People with Disabilities on December 3rd. If you could just read the summary of the recommendation.
Okay, this is an old one. It says D13. It just says the City of Toronto has hosted public events in recognition of Seniors Month, Pride, and an Indigenous Sunrise Ceremony, but no public event in recognition of people with disabilities as of yet.
Great. If I can just ask you to read the actual recommendation.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So, Executive Committee requests the Executive Director, People, Equity, and Human Rights to explore the feasibility of the City of Toronto holding a public event in recognition of International Day of People with Disabilities on December 3rd, 2019, and report to the next meeting of the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee on September 26th, 2019. The report could include identifying some key themes and topics of interest like employment, and should liaise with like-minded organizations such as the Centre for Independent Living in Toronto and options for a joint event information fair. I noticed the F is missing for independent living, but that's minor.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. The clerks will correct that on their copy. Are there any questions of the mover of the motion? Straightforward. I think we can all get behind that wonderful idea. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Even our staff want to put up their hands for that. And we'll definitely get everybody involved for that. So that brings us to the end of our meeting. I want to, actually, this might be one of their one of the few meetings we've actually concluded in advance of the 12:30. I want to thank everyone for their participation. This has been a really great discussion, even though our agenda wasn't full, but I think it kind of got to some of the heart of processes and how we actually need to work together in terms of governance. The September 26th TAC meeting is our very next meeting, which means we won't see you during the summer break. Please have a wonderful, safe, and enjoyable summer, and all the best to you and your family. We'll see you folks all in September, if not before, at some hopefully very accessible festival across the city. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to our staff for always the wonderful support.